This is Rod Evans, and this is the final exam review for Philosophy 303, Business Ethics for Old Dominion University. So what I want to do today is talk about first the time and date of the exam, final exam, and that of course is on your syllabus. Now I can email you a reminder a few days before the final exam. Most, if not all of you, will be taking the exam at the same time. If that is a burden for some of you, or for example, if you're 6 hours later, you're in Germany and you want to take it earlier, you can get in touch with me. We can arrange for that. We can handle that. But I want the vast majority of you to be taking the exam at the same time. Notice that I am making this exam open book and open notes, but it is timed, and you'll have 3 hours, but you shouldn't need 3 hours because we'll have gone over the material and there are no essays. So you'll get 3 hours from the time at which I email it to you. And again, for the vast majority of you, that'll be the time and the date of the final exam will be on the syllabus. Okay, as to the format, well, there are going to be 50 questions. There are 50 questions, 25 true false, 10 multiple choice, and 15 matching. And again, there are no essays. Okay, 50 questions, of course, each is going to count 2 points apiece. Okay, now, so we've talked about the format of the test. We've talked about the date and the time. I want to emphasize that although it is open book and open notes, you are not to collaborate with anyone else. You're going to do your own work. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to go over the review sheet for the final review for our business ethics class. Okay, first, whether our author Shaw agrees with Albert Carr's belief about business ethics. Okay, well, our author Shaw rejects Albert Carr's belief that many, if not most, ordinary moral norms will not apply to business. Shaw says that Carr's poker analogy is bad. Remember what Carr was saying. Carr was saying, well, just as games have their own rules, and as in poker, in which there is concealment of one's cards, right, and deception, because the idea of poker is that people are supposed to pretend to have a different hand from that which they have. Okay, so deception is a part of the game. But Shaw has said that the poker analogy is in fact bad, and not just Shaw. There are other ethicists who've said the same thing. I mean, for one thing, people consent to deception in poker, a game in which people win by defeating others. We have, though, laws against business fraud, because business is a cooperative enterprise in which people trade for mutual advantage. Okay, so there's some key dissimilarities, important dissimilarities between business and poker. And even in poker, there are rules against cheating, of course. I want to talk about, so again, Shaw disagrees with Albert Carr's belief about business ethics. Okay, second, whether ethical and psychological egoism are the same. Well, the answer is they're different. Ethical or rational egoism, and it's sometimes referred to as rational egoism, is a prescriptive or normative theory recommending what should be according to the theory, whereas psychological egoism is intended to be a descriptive theory attempting to describe how people actually behave. Okay, so I think that's important distinction. There's a sharp distinction between a theory that recommends behavior, talks about what should be, and a theory that purports to describe behavior. Okay, so again, ethical/rational egoism is a prescriptive theory. It recommends behavior. You can call it normative if you like, because it sets up standards of how people should behave. So you could say it's a prescriptive or normative theory again, and you could also say that psychological egoism is intended to be a purely descriptive theory, attempting to describe how people actually behave. And just as a reminder, psychological egoism, at least in its usual form, embodies a universal generalization stating that all people always do what they believe is in their self-interest, that all people always do what they believe is in their self-interest. Now notice, psychological egoism in no way contains the words ought or should or the concepts. It talks about what is, or it purports to talk about what is rather than what should be. Well, let's look at the third point or thing that you need to know on the review sheet: whether the following theories are teleological or deontological. Well, of course, you need to know those terms. The word teleological comes from a Greek word meaning end or target. It can also relate to goal. A teleological ethical theory prescribes or recommends how we should behave based on goals or consequences. Let me say it again. A teleological ethical theory prescribes how we should behave based on goals or consequences. Accordingly, Aristotle's ethical theory is based on the goal of what is sometimes referred to as self-realization, or more loosely, personal happiness, and is therefore teleological. Okay, so you need to know whether Aristotle's theory is teleological or deontological, and the answer is it is in fact. It is teleological. Now, utilitarianism is based on maximizing beneficial consequences and is therefore also teleological. Now, a theory is deontological to the extent that it prescribes our moral duties without direct appeal to consequences. Let me say it again. An ethical theory is deontological to the extent that it prescribes our moral duties without direct appeal to consequences. And therefore, Kant's theory, which is intended to be completely non-consequentialist, is deontological. So Kant's ethical theory is deontological, whereas Aristotle's theory, ethical theory, and utilitarianism are teleological. Okay? Now, number 4, what cultural relativism is and how has it been criticized? Okay? Well, cultural relativism, actually I will just show you this. Cultural relativism is a theory asserting that standards of morality, normality, rationality, and beauty are created by, dependent on, and relative to each culture. Again, it's a theory asserting that standards of morality, normality, rationality, and beauty are created by, dependent on, and relative to each culture. Now, critics of cultural relativism say that it implausibly implies that practices that, let's say, clearly violate the golden rule, which is considered like a basic moral norm, such as Nazi genocide of millions of peaceful people, can be morally right if the majority of a society will approve of that practice. Okay? So that is a very popular criticism of cultural relativism, that it seems to imply that practices that clearly violate the golden rule, again, such as the Nazi genocide of millions of peaceful people, can nonetheless be morally right in those cultures in which the majority approve of the practice. Critics say also that cultural relativism implies that moral judgments based on factual error, such as the erroneous belief that masturbation is harmful, can still be correct judgments if the majority of a society share the erroneous belief. Okay? So In other words, there may be some, let's say, some tribe, and let's suppose every member of the tribe, let's say, will believe that masturbation is harmful. And by the way, that was a very popular belief even in the United States and in Europe, even in the 19th century, even among some medical people. So in any event, okay, so somebody believes that, or let's say not just somebody, but a culture or a tribe, then consequently they condemn it, but they condemn it erroneously because it's incorrect that it's in fact harmful. Well, according to cultural relativism, it really doesn't matter whether anyone has a factual basis when the person condemns something as harmful. The mere fact that people believe that it's bad, if you get enough people believing it in a culture, and especially if we're talking about the majority and they've institutionalized in some way the belief, then that would mean masturbation is wrong in that, among that tribe or in that culture. Not simply considered wrong, but really is wrong. And a lot of people have a real problem with that. Critics of cultural relativism will say also that the theory really equates moral rightness. It equates moral rightness with what is popularly believed at a given time and place, so that it appears to rule out the possibility that some individual could be wiser than the multitudes. Think of Martin Luther King's opposition to racial segregation, right? Critics of cultural relativism will also say that the theory appears to rule out the possibility of real moral progress as opposed to simply moral change. I mean, it used to be widely believed that it was morally wrong to sell spoiled meat, of course, to members of one's own tribe, but that it was morally permissible to sell spoiled meat to strangers. Okay, but increasingly, prophets and philosophers and other people came along and said that everyone is one's neighbor and everyone counts morally. And many people think that the shift from a tribal morality to a more nearly universal morality was objective moral progress, constituting an expansion of the moral imagination. Now, let's look at the fifth thing that's mentioned on our final review sheet: whether our author Shaw believes that ethics needs a religious foundation. Shaw, by the way, in no way criticizes religion, but he does not believe, and I suppose he's typical among most Western philosophers, I suppose, but he believes that morality doesn't require a religious foundation. It doesn't need to have that to be undergirded by religious beliefs. Now, Shaw thinks that we all have an interest in reducing or preventing social conflict and suffering, and that we can evaluate practices on the basis of our shared basic interest in reducing social conflict and reducing suffering. Now, I want to talk about the sixth thing that's mentioned on this review sheet: what Jeremy Bentham thought, and how his concept of pleasure differed from that of Mill. Well, first of all, both Bentham and Mill were what are called classical utilitarians, by which I mean they believed first that that pleasure is the only thing intrinsically or inherently good, that is to say, good in and of itself. And second, that what we should do is to maximize the net pleasure, which is to say, the amount of pleasure we create minus any suffering. Okay, so both of them were classical utilitarians. Now, Jeremy Bentham, though, believed that pleasures can differ only in quantity, whereas J.S. Mill, believed that pleasures can differ in quantity and quality. Okay? I could do a whole lecture on that, but I don't need to for your purposes and for our purposes. But I do want you to know that Bentham and Mill, though they were both what are called classical utilitarians, they differed over the nature of pleasure. Whereas Bentham believed that pleasures can differ only in quantity, Mill believed that pleasures can differ in quantity and quality. Now, I want to talk about number 7. What did Immanuel Kant mean by a good will? For Kant, people have a goodwill, that is, they're morally motivated. It's the same thing. Exemplifying a goodwill and being morally motivated are the same. So people have a goodwill or are morally motivated when they do what is right because it's right. Okay? So think about that. Kant says, if you do what is right because it's right, you act in accordance with duty for the sake of duty, okay, what you're doing is worthy of moral esteem. Because you see, not only are you doing what is right, but you're doing what is right for like an ideal moral motive. You're doing what is right because it's right, okay? So that's what Kant meant by goodwill. He didn't mean benevolence. Benevolence literally means goodwill, but that's not what he meant. Kant meant that people are morally motivated when they do what is right because it's right, and that's when they have a goodwill. And he held that a goodwill is something that is good without qualification. Now, in a sense, he's already qualified it, because he said you have a goodwill when you're already doing what is right, and you're doing what is right because it's right. But he maintained having goodwill is unqualifiedly good or unconditionally good. Okay, and again, having a goodwill is to be morally motivated, and you have a goodwill when you do what is right because it is right. Okay, now let's look at number 8. Why did Ross reject utilitarianism? Well, Ross rejected utilitarianism as oversimplifying the moral life, which for Ross involves recognizing the multiple sources of our moral obligations. For Ross, the morally right action need not maximize pleasure. In fact, it's possible that some action could maximize pleasure without being the morally right thing to do. Okay? So Ross did not think we could simply look at the consequences of some action, try to project what they would be, and then say, well, if this creates more good consequences, it means it's automatically right. Ross held that we have diverse sources of our moral obligations. Parents have specific and special duties generated by their being parents, duties in relation to their children. Teachers have duties in relation to their students. Doctors have duties in relation to their patients. Sometimes we have duties that are grounded in our general humanity. And somebody's drowning, an innocent person is drowning in front of you, and you can throw a rope or a flotation device, right? Sometimes we have duties that are based on our voluntary agreements, as when people make promises or create contracts. Right? So there are going to be all sorts of ways in which people generate duties, and they have to do with a number of different things. Their circumstances, their role responsibilities. And so for Ross, utilitarianism is really an oversimple theory. In fact, he would say this of any theory that has an overarching standard and then says that all morality and all our moral duties are determined by this one standard. In fact, he said the same thing about Kant's theory of the categorical imperative. So in any event, again, Ross rejected utilitarianism as oversimplifying the moral life, which for Ross involves recognizing the multiple sources of moral obligations. And again, for Ross, the morally right action needn't maximize pleasure. Ross, by the way, was a non-consequentialist and thought that you needed to look at the moral character of our actions, and you couldn't determine what is right simply by looking at its consequences. Let's look at number 9. What did Ross mean by prima facie duties? For Ross, prima facie duties are duties we have in the absence of stronger, weightier duties. And a prima facie duty is a moral consideration in favor of certain action. Actual duties, of course, are full-fledged duties, all things considered. But prima facie duties have variable weight. Now, how can we understand this, you see? Okay, suppose you make a promise to meet somebody for lunch. Now, that will automatically become your actual duty. It's a prima facie duty in and of itself, but in the absence of any countervailing moral considerations, it will automatically become your actual duty, your duty all things considered. But suppose you promise to meet someone for lunch, but on the way you have a friend who's also your neighbor, who needs to be rushed to the hospital. Okay, well, your duty there would be to prevent further harm to your neighbor, because we could talk about something that's very serious and morally and medically, and so that prima facie duty could override your duty to keep your promise to meet someone for lunch. Now, that wouldn't mean that you wouldn't owe that the person to whom you're supposed to whom you made the promise to meet him or her for lunch an explanation and possibly even an apology, but it does mean that you would be justified in breaking that promise to fulfill the duty to rush your friend to the hospital. So prima facie duties are duties, other things being equal. And if you have only one prima facie duty, by default, it will become your actual duty, your duty, all things considered. Now, actual duties, of course, are duties, all things considered. Okay? So if you have more than one prima facie duty, if you have two prima facie duties, theoretically, the stronger, weightier of the two will become your actual duty. And if you have three, the strongest of the three prima facie duties will become your actual duty. Now, notice that Shaw said that we are usually pretty good at determining what our actual duties are, given the particular moral landscape that we're in, but we're not perfect. So sometimes we're not sure what the right thing to do, because we're just not sure what that is because of these competing strong prima facie duties. But again, I want you to understand a prima facie duty is a moral consideration in favor of doing something, and it will obtain in the absence of stronger or weightier moral considerations or duties. And so prima facie duty is a duty, other things being equal, and then an actual duty is a duty, all things considered. And again, that's Ross, and Ross believed that he was accurately clarifying the way most people think about morality. Now, I want to talk about what is supererogation. Supererogation will describe any actions that are beyond the call of duty. Okay? Supererogation, there we are. Supererogation describes actions beyond the call of duty. Okay? Now, so if somebody, walks and down the street and the person is not a professional rescuer, and sees a house that's on fire and then rushes in to try to save people, that could be a supererogatory action, and that could be morally heroic but not morally required. Let me look at number 11. How do socialists differ from libertarians? Well, socialists believe that the economy should be heavily regulated by government to minimize differences in income and wealth. Now, according to a popular textbook definition, socialism involves governmental ownership of the major means of production and distribution. And of course, Marx's scientific socialism involved that feature. But in any event, we can say the following. We can say that socialists and libertarians will necessarily disagree over the extent to which the government should own and control businesses. Libertarians want to minimize the government's economic involvement, whereas the socialists have no problem with the government getting deeply involved in the economy to reduce differences in wealth and income. Who was Alan Bakke? Okay, that's B-A-K-K-E. Who was Alan Bakke? Well, he was a man who was denied admission to medical school at the University of California at Davis. He sued, claiming that he was denied admission because he was Caucasian, and he maintained that if he had been one of the minorities preferentially admitted, that he would have been admitted. So he took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he won it in a 5-4 decision. So all I want you to know about that is Bakke was a Caucasian who was a person who applied to get into the medical school at the University of California at Davis. He was denied admission, and he maintained that given his credentials and his grades and how well he performed, presumably on the medical, the MCAT, that in fact he should have gotten in. He did not get in, and he won his case 5-4. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about the doctrine of comparable worth. What is it? Okay. Well, first of all, the doctrine of comparable worth concerns men and women. It has nothing directly to do with ethnicity. And what it says is that men and women should be paid on the same scale for not only the same job, but also for different jobs requiring the same level of training, skill, and responsibility. So again, the doctrine of comparable worth concerns if you like, the income and salaries of men and women, and it says that they should be paid on the same scale. Again, not simply for the same job, but also for different jobs requiring the same level of training, skill, and responsibility. So I want you to know that. I want you to know also what is sexual harassment or harassment, either way. Well, there are different forms of it, okay? But let's just say that what are some of the things that can clearly qualify as sexual harassment or harassment? Well, let's take sexual language or behavior that is offensive and unwanted. And it can take different forms. It can involve threats, either subtle or quite explicit. Someone says or implies that the person must sleep with him, and often it's men who are sexually harassing women. It doesn't have to be that, but more often, as a matter of fact than not, it is. So if some supervisor makes it clear to some person, the person supervising, let's say it's a male and a woman, sleep with me if you want to get the job, or even if you want to keep the job or get a promotion. Okay, that's called a quid pro quo sexual harassment. That's what that's called. Now, sexual harassment can involve offensive sexual languages when someone repeatedly uses language, as when telling jokes that are unwelcome. And then that's the case in which a person is creating a hostile work environment. Now, I do want to mention that it is possible for someone to say something that may offend at least one other person, and yet it may not be just a clear and definite case and definitive case of sexual harassment. Let's just take this an isolated verbal incident. So let's say it's a sexual joke, and let's say the teller didn't know that it would be offensive. Okay, I mean, I've given the example of, well, I gave it a slightly different example, but it was an example in a lecture of two guys talking about a scene in some let's say R-rated movie. It's a sexual scene, and they're talking about it in the break room, right? And then somebody comes in, some woman walks in, and their backs are toward her, and so they don't even know she's in the room, right? She walks in, and she's offended that anyone is even talking about sex at work at all, even if it's in the break room, and she may take offense, but that would not be a clear and definitive example of sexual harassment. Okay, for one thing, they didn't even know she was there, and so that's important to understand. And for another, if you want to take a really clear and definitive case of sexual harassment, and it could involve joke telling, okay, think of a case in which someone tells jokes that are sexual, and there are at least one woman, and maybe more than one, who will say, you know what, I don't think that's appropriate, I'm extremely offended, please don't do that any longer. And then the joke teller, laughs and continues to tell other sexual jokes at work. Yes, that can clearly count as sexual harassment and contributing to a hostile workplace. Now, I want to talk about what would be normally number 15 if one were to number these. Well, it says, what are some arguments for and against affirmative action? Well, they're in your book. One of the main ones in favor is the idea of trying to make the work environment a more nearly equal place because of the historical mistreatment of minorities, and to try to help level out the playing field. And one of the arguments against affirmative action is the belief that white males may in fact be deprived of various opportunities even though they personally have not discriminated against someone. So there are arguments both for and against affirmative action, and they in fact are covered in our book. And you need to have at least some familiarity with those sorts of arguments. Number 16, how does Rawls argue for his theory of justice? What is the original position, and why does he use it? John Rawls's theory of justice involves the original, what he calls original position, and that involves a thought experiment in which rationally self-interested agents decide on what practices and institutions will be acceptable to them when all they know about themselves is their rational self-interestedness. That's okay. So that's the theory of justice, and it's a contractarian theory. It begins with the original position, and that involves rationally self-interested agents. In other words, they're capable of acting rationally, they're capable of following principles, and what they want is what's in their long-term self-interest, presumably the long-term happiness. And that's how his original position begins. They're going to try to come up with various principles and institutions that would maximize their chances for long-term self-interest and personal happiness. Okay, now, and by the way, Rawls thinks that if people follow the way he's setting things up, that his position would be fair, and it would minimize the chance of things that are intrinsically unjust. Okay, now I'm not going to go into great detail here. We've talked about this before. We talked about the idea that the original people in the original position are going to minimize the worst that could happen to them, right? And so presumably there are going to be some institutions such as slavery, hereditary aristocracy, religious caste systems that are just going to be ruled out from the beginning because they would definitely be institutions and practices that would exploit one group for other people, and all of us have an interest in not being exploited. So I want to look at number 17. How does Rawls use the veil of ignorance? And first of all, what is it? Okay. Well, the veil of ignorance is a device Rawls uses according to which agents are to choose principles while ignoring personal attributes that could bias them, such as their sex, ethnicity, talents, religion, and wealth. Okay, now think about it. The veil of ignorance. Now, normally ignorance is a bad thing, but in this case, the veil of ignorance is designed to minimize bias, and including institutional bias. And so, why is Rawls doing this? Well, let's suppose he had a theory that didn't involve the veil of ignorance. What could happen is, let's suppose the majority of people in a society, or at least, let's suppose they have a lot of influence and they're white males and they have property. And they're very aggressive and assertive. And they say, you know what? We think only white males who belong to this particular religion should be allowed to vote, should be allowed to hold office. Okay. Well, Rawls's position was, well, that's just unfair. Why should those be morally relevant to whether somebody should be allowed to hold office or to vote? The fact that somebody's a white male and has property, see? So what Rawls said was, let's assume that, let's base things on rational self-interest. Let's begin there. But let us begin by asking people to bracket or ignore those attributes, personal attributes they have that could bias them, okay? And this is what he called the veil of ignorance. So that means when you're trying to figure out what kind of society you want to live under, and what kind of rules you want to live under, and what kind of institutions you want to live under, then what you need to do is ignore what sex you are, your ethnicity, your talents, your religion, and your wealth. Okay, just remember that you could be born of a different sex, of a different ethnicity, and you may not of a different religion, and you may not be born into wealth through no fault of your own. Okay, so that's why he has the veil of ignorance, to try to minimize bias. Now, let's look at 18. How would you say Nozick's theory differs from that of Rawls. Nozick's theory, which is libertarian, okay, we're talking about the book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, begins with a belief in natural rights, including the natural property rights. For Nozick, people are entitled to their holdings, provided that they acquire them without the use of fraud or violence. Okay? The holdings is what people can own. It includes wealth, income, rights to what they've created, including books and works of art. So for Nozick, again, people are entitled to their holdings, provided that they acquired them without using fraud or violence. Rawls, in contrast, does not believe in natural property rights, but sees rules governing property as allowing for at least some redistribution of income and wealth in accordance with rules flowing from Rawls's thought experiment. Okay? So Rawls doesn't believe in natural property rights, but sees rules governing property as allowing for at least some redistribution of income and wealth in accordance with rules flowing from Rawls's thought experiment. I want to talk about what would be number 19 if one were numbering these things in the review sheet. How is Rawls' theory related to but different from utilitarianism? Well, Rawls' theory is certainly concerned with increasing happiness, but it certainly isn't anything like an unqualified utilitarianism. In fact, Rawls thinks that utilitarianism cannot, by itself, unqualified, cannot take individuals' rights as seriously as it should, as determined by the choices made under a veil of ignorance. Okay, so Rawls thought that under utilitarianism, you could have a situation in which the majority are tyrannical in relation to individuals or minorities. Okay, so let's talk about, and these are going to be some items that are going to be, let's say, on the matching part. For example, strict liability. Okay, we can talk first of all about strict liability or strict product liability. Let me first talk about strict liability itself. Okay, well, typically a crime involves, I know I should have written this in black, but anyway, it involves mens rea, that is a guilty mind, and as well as a criminal act. Now, you have a guilty mind when you commit a crime intentionally, negligently, recklessly, or maliciously. Okay. Now, and a criminal act. Okay. So let's just a criminal act. I don't know. Let's say you hit somebody in the face. Okay. Well, that may not be hitting someone in the face. By the way, it depends on the context. There could be a context in which that would not be criminal, especially when somebody's got a gun and you're innocent and trying to shoot you, or got a knife and you're trying to defend yourself. But typically, a criminal act will involve both a guilty mind and a guilty act. Okay. Now, in strict product liability, manufacturers can be held liable if their products harm consumers when the products are used as intended, even when the products weren't created with negligence. In other words, you could actually successfully sue a manufacturer if you're using some product that is judged to be unreasonably dangerous when used as it's intended. Okay, so that could, so that's strict. By the way, what's a good example of just ordinary strict liability? You can have a strict liability statute, for example, when it comes to some tavern owners, let's say, selling liquor to someone underage. You could have a situation in which someone could look of age, someone could have a realistic-looking phony ID, and yet the tavern owner could still be charged with a crime. So it's not, you're not necessarily the tavern owner was, let's say, negligent, and yet the tavern owner could still be charged with crime. So it's just whenever some business sells liquor to someone underage under any circumstances, it is a crime. Okay, that would be strict liability. Again, strict product liability would involve the ability of people successfully to sue manufacturers, and even though in creating the product, the manufacturers were not negligent or not provably negligent. The mere fact that the intentional use of the product and using it as it's intended could be unreasonably dangerous. That alone could be grounds for winning a case of strict product liability when it comes to suing a manufacturer. Now, I also want to talk about what is a grease payment. A grease payment is money given to usually low-level officials to speed up lawful transactions. What's a good example of a grease payment? Well, suppose you represent your corporation. You want to get the goods of your corporation into some foreign country, and then you're negotiating this, and you're negotiating this with some low-level government official. And as everything, just before everything seems to be negotiated, the official goes, "Oh, by the way, there's a fee, kind of an unofficial fee, that you really need to pay if you want to get your goods here in my place punctually." And my place is his country, and that could be what you might call a grease payment. In other words, it's money given to a low-level official to speed up a lawful transaction. Okay, it's money that the corporation would prefer not to pay. Right? In any event, it's not a bribe. It's not money given to someone to violate his or her role responsibilities. But that's a good example of what I just talked about of a grease payment. What is socialism? Well, if you look at the textbook definition, and if you look at least to some degree the way Marx looked at it, it would involve the public ownership of the means of production, and of course extensive regulation of the economy to try to minimize differences in income and wealth. Okay. Again, if you look at the textbook, or one of the main textbook definitions, the public ownership of the means of production and extensive regulation of the economy to try to minimize differences in income and wealth. Okay, what is ethical egoism? Okay, now, ethical egoism. What is ethical egoism? Ethical egoism is a prescriptive theory. It's a prescriptive theory holding that morally right actions should promote self-interest, right? So I want you to know what ethical egoism is. I want you to know that ethical egoism is also sometimes known as rational egoism. And it would be helpful for you to know, although I'm not sure I'm going to test you on this, that Ayn Rand was the most famous ethical or rational egoist in the 20th century. Aynrand, Ayn Rand. And there are different forms of ethical or rational egoism, right? There's a universal or impersonal form, and that's the form that Ayn Rand defended, and that says that all people should promote their enlightened self-interest. Okay, that's the universal or impersonal form. Again, that was defended by Ayn Rand, but it's a prescriptive theory holding that morally right actions should promote self-interest. The universal or impersonal form, again, that's what Ayn Rand accepted, so that all people should promote their enlightened self-interest. There is also a personal form. Now, say that Popeye is a personal ethical egoist, and that means that Popeye believes that he, Popeye, should promote his enlightened self-interest, but he doesn't believe that other people should. And if he believed that everybody should, he would be an impersonal or universal ethical or rational egoist. So a personal ethical egoist believes that he or she should promote his or her self-interest, but doesn't believe that all people should promote their self-interest. Okay. And the categorical imperative, what is the categorical imperative? The categorical imperative, according to Kant, is the ultimate moral standard, the criterion for defining our moral duties. Okay, so let's think about that. The categorical imperative. Now, what does categorical mean? It means unconditional or unqualified. Imperative is something that must be done. According to Kant, if you had an actual moral duty, then you couldn't get out of it by saying you don't feel like fulfilling it. Okay, so according to Kant, actual moral duties are categorical imperatives. They, in fact, everybody should be under them who's rational. Every rational being is under a categorical imperative according to Kant. Now, there are different formulations of the categorical imperative to highlight different aspects of it. For example, the categorical imperative says that your action will be morally acceptable provided that it follows from a law acceptable to all rational beings thinking rationally. So this is sometimes called the feature of universalizability. Okay, so now remember, Kant believed that he was simply clarifying. He was simply clarifying the logical features of conscientious moral thinking. So again, Kant says that your action will be morally acceptable provided that it follows from a rule treated as a universal law acceptable to all rational beings thinking rationally. So for example, let's suppose that you make a promise. Ask yourself this, and this is what Kant would say. You make a promise, could you make a promise with a view to breaking it at your earliest convenience and have that rule function as a universal moral law acceptable to all rational beings thinking rationally? Okay, could we have let's say your personal rule, which Kant called your maxim. Could your maxim says, I'm going to make a promise with a view to breaking it? Could that be universalized into a universal law acceptable to all rational beings thinking rationally? And Kant would say no. Kant would say that can't be. Kant says that you couldn't do that because, for one thing, we couldn't have the institution of promise making without people's accepting the idea that they need to be willing to discharge promises even when they're inconvenient. In fact, that's part of the whole point of promise making, is to bind people to an uncertain future, and especially when it can be inconvenient to discharge the promise. So if everyone has a moral entitlement to break promises whenever he or she feels like it, and people are just regularly making promises with a view to breaking them, then that could not be, that attitude could not be universalized, and we couldn't be universalized while still having the institution of promise making and keeping. Okay, now, so the other thing that I want to bring to your attention is Kant said another feature of the categorical imperative is that it requires us always to treat ourselves and others as ends in themselves and never merely as means to ends. Now, what does that mean? Kant said that people have inherent value. They have dignity. They have value just in virtue of their being rational beings with a rational will. And what he said was, you shouldn't look at people as simply having use value or market value. You shouldn't do that, because people also have intrinsic value as rational beings. So Kant said it is always wrong to treat oneself or others merely as means to ends rather than as ends in themselves. So I think, for example, that somebody rushes in and steals from somebody simply for his or her own benefit. Think about someone who defrauds people of money. They're treating others merely as means to ends. Now, I want to also talk about the Maximin rule. The Maximin rule is a rule rationally self-interested agents will use, according to Rawls, when they can't be sure of all the consequences of their actions. Okay, so the thing about the Maxim rule is as a practical postulate of self-interested rationality. A practical postulate of self-interested rationality. Okay, so it would counsel the following. It says that rationally self-interested agents will use this rule when they can't be sure of all the consequences of their actions. Now, what is the rule? Well, specifically, in conditions of uncertainty, choose those actions that will most likely minimize the worst that can happen to you. Okay? In conditions of uncertainty, choose those actions that will most likely minimize the worst that can happen to you. Now, Rawls says, well, what does that mean? That means that if you are trying to create a just society and you want it to have fair principles and institutions, you will eliminate from the beginning slavery, you will eliminate hereditary aristocracy, you will eliminate religious caste systems. Okay, they'll be eliminated by the Maximin rule, because you don't want to be a slave. You don't want to be an untouchable in a religious caste system. You don't want to be a peasant when it comes to hereditary aristocracy. And then because if you were, you would not only not be treated very well, but you'd have very little, if any, opportunity for upward mobility. Now I want to talk also about caveat emptor. Caveat emptor means buyer beware, expressing the idea that it is the buyer's responsibility to be as prudent as possible in buying products. Caveat emptor, Latin, buyer beware, expressing the idea that it is the buyer's responsibility to be as prudent as possible in buying products. The idea of buyer beware and caveat emptor was really more widely respected in the 19th century than later. Okay, now what I also want to do is I want to give you some practice questions for the true-false practice questions. I'll give you a lot of them. Okay, how about this? Egoism and rational egoism, ethical egoism and rational egoism are the same theory. Ethical egoism and rational egoism are the same theory. Well, that's true. That's true. Ethical and rational egoism are the same theory. How about this? Number 2. Ethical egoism is different from psychological egoism. Ethical egoism is different from psychological egoism. Well, as a matter of fact, that is true, because ethical egoism concerns how people should behave. Psychological egoism purports to describe how people in fact behave. Okay, so that is true, that they're different. How about number 3? Kant's theory is deontological. Yes, deontological means that it's non-consequentialist. It's ethical theory. And his ethical theory, by the way, is supposed to be purely deontological. That is to say, Kant thought that through our reason we can evaluate what is the right thing to do according to the categorical imperative, and what will be right will be intrinsically or inherently right, and what will be wrong will be intrinsically or inherently wrong. So Kant did not think we should appeal directly to consequences in determining right and wrong. So anyway, Kant's theory is in fact deontological. 4. Utilitarian theory is deontological. Well, certainly that's false. Utilitarian theory is an excellent example of a consequentialist or a teleological ethical theory. It's consequentialist. It says right and wrong are determined by consequences, either those of actions or those of the networks of rules. So it's false that utilitarian theory is deontological or non-consequential. 5. According to Shaw, our author, your conscience will never mislead you. Okay? Well, you know, in true-false questions, that when they say never or always, more often than not, they're going to be false, right? Well, in any event, that's a good... See, that's something... If you have a true-false question that's very highly qualified, and you don't know anything else about it, there's a decent chance it's going to be true. But if you have a true-false question that talks about always or never, there's a good chance that it's going to be false. Okay, so Shaw says our conscience is useful, but he doesn't say it's infallible. Why? Because people can be ignorant of the real consequences of their actions. So someone could think that masturbation is in fact dangerous when it's not, and he could conscientiously condemn it, right? And furthermore, someone could be prejudiced against whole groups of people, and they might have been taught that that's the right way to be. Okay, so therefore the conscience is a guide to conduct. It's something that we should have at least some respect for, but realize that it is in fact fallible. Number 6, a fully deontological theory can also be a consequentialist one. Well, no, because if it's fully deontological, that means it's fully non-consequentialist. So they're contrasting terms. So if any system is purely or fully deontological, it can't also be consequential. So that's going to be false. How about 7? Critics of cultural relativism say that it is incompatible with the possibility of moral wisdom and moral progress. Okay. Well, that is going to be true. Now, by the way, I don't mind displaying this for you, and I will in a moment. 8. Bentham and Mill were famous utilitarians. That's true. Bentham and Mill differed over whether pleasures can differ in quality is also true. So in any event, let's look at this. A fully deontological theory can also be consequentialist. Critics of cultural relativism say that it is incompatible with the possibility of moral wisdom and moral progress. Bentham and Mill were famous utilitarians. Certainly that is true. Number 9, Bentham and Mill differed over whether pleasures can differ in quality, and that's true. Mill thought pleasures can differ in quality and quantity, Bentham only in quantity. And by the way, since I'm doing this, let's look at this other one. Let's be consistent. Ethical egoism and rational egoism are the same theory. True. Ethical egoism is different from psychological egoism. True. Kant's theory is deontological. True. Utilitarian theory is deontological. False. According to Shaw, our author, your conscience will never mislead you. False. Okay? You obviously can pause this stuff, so I'm not going to just leave this up for a long time. But anyway, so again, according to Shaw, our author, your conscience will never mislead you. That's going to be false. Okay. How about this? For Kant, a person who has a goodwill acts from sympathy for others. No. Even though you talk about benevolence means having a goodwill, that's not what Kant meant. Kant says you have a goodwill when you do what is right because it's right. 11. W.D. Ross thought that there is one ultimate standard and source for all moral duties. No. He thought that both utilitarianism and Kant's theory of the categorical imperative oversimplify the moral life. So Ross did not think there's one ultimate standard and source of for all moral duties. 12. Supererogatory acts are morally required. No. If they're supererogatory, that means they're beyond the call of duty. 13. Kant was a utilitarian. Emphatically, no. Kant was not a utilitarian. He was a ethical deontologist. Kant believed that we can, through reason, determine what is right, and he believed that right actions are intrinsically or inherently right, and wrong actions are intrinsically or inherently wrong. 14. J.S. Mill originated the expression prima facie duty. Of course, that's false. It wasn't Mill. It was Ross, W.D. Ross. Okay. So let's look at this again. We've got, for Kant, a person who has a goodwill acts from sympathy for others. That's false. That's not what Kant meant by goodwill. W.D. Ross thought there's one ultimate standard and source for all moral duties. That's false. 12. Supererogatory acts are morally required. That's false. Kant was a utilitarian. That's false. 14. J.S. Mill originated the expression prima facie duty. In fact, that's also going to be false, right? It wasn't J.S. Mill, it was W.D. Ross. Okay. How about this? John Rawls allows for some economic inequalities, provided that they benefit the least well off. And that's certainly true. Rawls did think you could have a system in which there's some economic inequalities and they could actually motivate people to be more creative and productive, but you also simultaneously had to be concerned with those who are the least well off. 16, if one were to number these things. Socialists and libertarians have to disagree over economics and the role of government. Of course, that's necessarily true. Socialists and libertarians have to disagree over economics and the role of government. Libertarians want to minimize the government's role in our lives. They don't want no government. They want minarchy, minimal government, to protect our rights to life, liberty, and property. But they're not anarchists. So how about 17? Alan Bakke won his Supreme Court case against the University of California. That's true. So here's what this would look like. 15. Rawls allows for some economic inequalities provided that they benefit the least well off. 16. Socialists and libertarians have to disagree over economics and the role of government. That's going to be true. 17. Alan Bakke won his Supreme Court case against the University of California. True. True. 18. The doctrine of comparable worth. The doctrine of comparable worth says that white and black people should receive equal pay for the same occupation. Well, that's just way off. It's not directly about ethnicity. It doesn't talk about simply equal pay for equal same occupations. It talks about equal being paid on the same scale for even different occupations requiring the same degree of responsibility in education, training, and so on. How about 19? Normally, an isolated sexual joke won't definitively constitute sexual harassment. And that's actually true. Now, remember what I said, that if someone knowingly ends up doing something that's unwelcome, and that means like repeatedly telling a sexual joke over against people's preferences, expressed preferences, yeah, sure. I mean, that's certainly a good case of sexual harassment. But if somebody tells one joke, didn't know that it was going to be offensive, but if one person's offended, that normally would not constitute a kind of definitive example, an indisputable example of sexual harassment. 20. One argument for affirmative action programs is they are needed to permit fairer competition. Well, that's certainly true. So, as we look at this, the doctrine of comparable worth says that white and black people should be receive equal pay for the same occupations. False. Let me read that again. The doctrine of comparable worth says that white and black people should receive equal pay for the same occupations. False. 19. Normally, an isolated sexual joke won't definitively constitute sexual harassment. True. 20. One argument for affirmative action programs is that they are needed to permit fairer competition. True. True. Okay, how about libertarians and socialists will most likely disagree over right to medical care? Well, that's true. They would most likely disagree over right to medical care, whereas socialists saying yes, people have such a right, libertarians saying no, more likely saying no, they don't. How about 22? Rawls rejects utilitarianism. True. 23. Rawls accepts Nozick's entitlement theory. False. He does not accept Nozick's entitlement theory. Remember, Nozick said that people are entitled to their holdings if and only if they acquire them justly without fraud or violence. Rawls disagrees. He thinks we also have to be concerned, especially with those who are the least fortunate. And Rawls's theory seems to imply the existence of some sort of welfare state, at least in the most prosperous economies. Okay, now, how about 24? Rawls accepts the concept of a social contract in his theory of justice. Yes, I mean, that's a central feature of it, the idea of a social contract. So, 21, libertarians and socialists will most likely disagree over a right to medical care. True. Rawls, it says let me look at this again. He rejects utilitarianism. Yes. How about 23? Rawls accepts Nozick's entitlement theory. That's false. False. How about 24? Rawls accepts the concept of a social contract in his theory of justice. That is going to be true. That's an essential and a central feature, really, of Rawls's theory, the idea of a social contract. Okay. How about this? Rawls's veil of ignorance is to remove possible sources of bias from criteria for defining just principles. That's true. That is its central purpose, to remove possible sources of bias from criteria for defining just principles. 26. The landmark case rejecting the idea of separate but equal was Brown v. Board of Education. Well, that's true. The landmark case rejecting the idea of separate but equal was Brown v. Board of Education. 27. Libertarians disapprove of minimum wage laws. That's true. Number 28. Libertarians disapprove of rent control laws. That's going to be true too. So actually everything here of those four, everything's going to be true. Rawls's veil of ignorance is to remove possible sources of bias from criteria for defining just principles. 26. The landmark case rejecting the idea of separate but equal was Brown v. Board of Education. 27. Libertarians disapprove of minimum wage law. That's true. 28. Libertarians disapprove of rent control laws. That'll be true too. Okay, remember, libertarians want to minimize the role of the government in economic transactions. Okay, now, how about this? Ethical egoism is about how people should act, not a description of how they in fact act. Well, that's certainly true. It is about how people should act. It's not about a description about how they in fact act. That's not intended. It's not intended for that. How about 30? The categorical imperative says that an acceptable moral rule is one that all rational beings thinking rationally would accept. Well, that's true. Okay, so again, ethical egoism is about how people should act, not a description of how they in fact act. The categorical imperative says that an acceptable moral rule is one that all rational beings thinking rationally would accept. All rational beings thinking rationally would accept. That's true as well. That is true as well. Both of these are true, 29 and 30. Okay, so now the other thing, well, basically I covered what I wanted to cover. Okay, so again, to emphasize this, the key points, you are going to be emailed to your student account. You're going to be emailed the final exam during the hour and time, and actually the date that are mentioned on the syllabus. And within a few days before that, I can send you a reminder email. Now, the test is open book, open notes, but it's timed. What does that mean? That means within 3 hours after you get the test, or after it goes to your email, you are to return it. Most of you, if not all of you, will be able to return it before then, because there are 50 questions and there are no essays. There are no essays. And this is a very thorough review. Again, it's open book, open notes. It's not, however, a joint or collaborative effort. You're supposed to do your own work, okay? And what you're supposed to do is you fill out this, you type your answers, you save them, and then you send the document to me at revans@odu.edu. Okay, revans@odu.edu. If you really absolutely need to take the test at a different time, especially within, let's say, 12 or 24 hours, either before or after it's offered for most students, you need to let me know, okay? Again, if you're in Germany, you'll be taking it, and if I were to give it to you at the time I'm giving it in Eastern Daylight Time, let's say, for example, then what's going to happen is you're going to end up getting it several hours later. I mean, some people could end up getting it 6 hours later. In any event, what I want you to understand is that although just about almost all of you will be taking it at the same time, if you contact me and say, you know what, that's just too inconvenient, can you give it to me 12 hours earlier or 6 hours earlier or 12 hours later, let's say, that can be done. I don't want that to be the norm, but it could be done. For the vast majority of you, I expect you to be ready to receive your test at the originally scheduled time and date, which again is on your syllabus. Okay, and remember, you'll be typing out your answers, and again, realize it's true, false, it's multiple choice, and it's matching. No essays. There'll be 50 questions, because you type out your answers, and then you save your document, and then you send it as an attachment to revans@odu.edu. It's going to be given to you in Word. I'd like it returned in Word, not Google Documents, and that's what I'd like to happen. I hope that's clear. If you guys have further questions, please contact me through email. If you guys also would like to schedule a phone conference with me, a little phone chat, it could be a longer phone chat. It could be for 20, 30 minutes or so or more. That's fine too. But you need to keep in touch. I'm going to try to I'll do everything I can to keep in touch with you, but I need to know if you have any concerns. But I think you will find this will be a very useful review. And remember, the test, open book, open notes, okay? And at the same time, it is timed. And you're supposed to do your own work. You're not to consult with any other person. Okay, I hope that is clear. Again, if you have any questions, please let me know, or any concerns. Thank you.